They're calling it Miracle on the Hudson.
You just heard the pilot, brace yourself for impact.
And that's when I knew that, we were going down.
A U.S. Airways plane loses power and then makes an emergency landing on the Hudson River.
Captain Sully did something no other pilot should ever have to do. After being struck down by birds, he landed his plane on the Hudson River. Right after it occurred, newscasters were going crazy. Everyone wanted to interview him, and there was a lot of speculation as to if this was something he really had to do. Now, 10 years later, he reflects on his experience way back when, shares the story, and even goes into detail on his bodily responses in the moment and his assurance that he did exactly what he knew he needed to do. I'll be looking at two different parts of the speech, the verbal side and the nonverbal side, and we'll kind of discuss the things that he did well, the things he could work on, and we'll walk away with some tips at the end. As if he's writing in a book, Captain Sully narrates his story in grave detail, describing the type of engine, the shape, the size of the birds, etc.
And then they filled the windscreen as if it were a Hitchcock film. And this was a large flock of large birds. The species Canada geese, they weigh 8 or 10, sometimes 12 pounds. They have 5 foot or 6 foot wingspans.
What I liked about the way in which he explains this is that it's in such thorough detail that the listener can physically experience it with him. So they can experience what they think it's like to be in a Hitchcock film. They can experience the size of the birds and really get the seriousness of the situation just through listening. Now, it's really nice that the video has those clips so you can kind of visualize it through that. But as a listener, I could close my eyes and still experience everything he's saying. Now, in the next clip that I'll show you, he talks about his physiological state and his experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after we've seen it.
I could feel my pulse shoot up, my blood pressure spike, my perceptual field narrow in tunnel vision because of the stress.
Sully does a great job of bringing himself down at a normal human level. When we think about pilots, we think about firefighters, anybody that's potentially in charge of our life, we kind of put them on this pedestal. We expect them to always know everything. We expect them to not have the same stress responses that we do. But he is stating, hey, I'm a human too, and this was my experience. And that's exactly what he says prior to giving the explanation about his bodily responses. He says, I had normal human responses. So when he goes to explain what's happening in his body, the listener can understand the experience. They might not like necessarily feel the experience as he's saying it, just because that's really big to get your body to experience that as well, unless you're extremely empathetic somehow. However, the listener knows what that feels like. The listener knows what it feels like to be under stress. So he's connecting with his audience, he's explaining his story, and he's allowing the listener to feel it with him. And that's what makes this so powerful. Sully also uses a great speech tool, which is to track what he's saying as he goes. So at one point in time, he talks about the thoughts he's having in his head as the plane is coming down. He gives a thought, he gives an explanation to the thought, wraps it up, gives the next thought, gives an explanation to the thought, gives the next thought, and gives an explanation. And prior to all of that, he tells the audience he has 3 thoughts. So this is really helpful for the audience to track what he's saying, and it actually keeps the audience more engaged. Now, one thing that really bothered me in the speech was how he described why he said brace for impact. Now, when we think about a pilot, we naturally assume that there's a set of words that they're supposed to use. Brace for landing, brace for impact, all these different things. But he goes on to explain why he selected each word. And these explanations are pretty long, and I feel like they detract from what he's actually trying to say, which was that this was a very significant moment and what he said had to be important. But for him to describe each word felt a little overdone, because we naturally assume there's a vocabulary for pilots that they pull from, and they don't really need to explain why they selected each word. So as we close out on the verbal experience of this speech, let's walk away with a big tip. Okay, it's really, really important that you narrate, especially if you're telling a story, you narrate for your audience what the audience needs to know in order to be able to experience it with you. But you want to leave behind what the audience doesn't need to know. okay? Because once you start to explain too much, you're actually detracting from the story, you're distracting the audience, and you're making them less interested in what you have to say, and they're going to fixate on the fact that they don't like how you're explaining it, rather than fixate on the fact that what you're telling is important. So now we'll talk about the nonverbal side of his speech, which is personally my favorite thing to talk about. What's interesting about this speech in particular is that it's actually in front of a camera. There's no audience known, though it could be anybody, everybody, or no one. Whereas in a larger speech, you kind of can see your whole audience. And what's nice about it is you can use your hands, you can gesture, you can do all sorts of different things. But in this speech in particular, it looks like Sully's hands are below the camera at all time. So he has to rely on all of his nonverbal cues to get big, serious points across. He could share his story, but sharing a story like this, it wouldn't really help him. So he uses things like facial expressions. He does a fantastic job of facial expressions, and we'll give an example of that. He somewhat utilizes pitch. I wish he would utilize it more, but we will share an example of that. And then lastly, he does a great job at utilizing speed. He talks really, really fast at some points, and at other points he talks really, really slow. And he does a great job of taking pauses. These pauses allow the listener to digest what he's saying, and honestly, I feel like it allows them to engage more because it tells the seriousness of the situation every time that he takes a pause. So in this first example, we're gonna see Sully narrow his eyes, squint a little bit, with determination, as long as I could solve the problem. What's so great about this and the way in which he does it is that he's narrowing in with his eyes on the problem and seeing it as a challenge. Now, we can't say that for certain that that's exactly what's happening, but as a listener, as a watcher, that's what we're seeing, and that's, at least for me, what I'm experiencing now. As if you were to say, as long as I could solve the problem. It almost comes across as a little bit stressed when you open your eyes wide. It looks like you're unprepared. It's like hectic. He does a really great job of expressing confidence just alone in his facial expressions.
As long as I could solve the problem.
So in this next clip, we'll see Sully speed up as he talks. And I want you to pay attention to the way in which you feel in your body when he does this. Because for me, it sends energy into my being. We were coming down so rapidly, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's a sense of urgency, and I'm feeling it as if I'm there in the moment with him. And Sully does a great job throughout the entirety of his speech, making the listener feel like they're there with him.
And we were coming down so rapidly, if I misjudged it even by a fraction, we might start too soon and get too slow and hit hard. So
when Sully does shift pitch, it's usually when he's referring to a conversation. So then he has a conversation between him and the audience, right? And he speaks at this lower tone. It sounds more confident. It sounds more serious. And then when he shifts to talk about a conversation between him and his co-pilot, it's lighter, it's friendlier, it's more conversational. And I find that fascinating that that's the only time in which he shifts pitch, really, because there's a lot of points in time at which he could, and he chooses not to.
I turned to each other at that moment, at the same time, using the same words, said, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought. But we weren't high-fiving.
So I'll end the nonverbal cues on this kind of goofy, silly point. He, at the end of it, he kind of goes on this blinking rampage, so to speak, in which he doesn't really seem to blink that much throughout the entire video, and then all of a sudden, as soon as he's done talking, it's like boom, 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 boom. I don't even want to do it because it's so uncomfortable as a watcher to experience. I'll let you watch it and think what you think about it. My biggest tip when it comes to nonverbal cues is to know what's important for your audience. So if you have a large audience and you can't really see them that far away, how important are facial expressions actually? And when you have a small audience, what's important? You kind of want to fixate on the things that you can do so the listener can engage, but you don't want to do it too much. Like we noticed with the blinking, it was a little too much, and why? I don't understand it. But Sully did a great job in some of the nonverbal cues. Like I said, he really used speed, he used pauses, he used facial expressions. He even, at some points, he lifted his body. Like if we were to go back and watch the video of which we talked about his change in pitch, he lifted his body as if he was changing his pitch far before he lifted his pitch himself. So my biggest tip is to use all of your tools that would be important. Don't leave any of them out. Again, if you're talking in a big audience, your biggest cue is going to be your arms. So using those when you can, but making sure that it's natural. Now, just to go back over it, Sully did a great job on the verbal and nonverbal side at the end of the day. I think that there were just a few things that he could have done better, but overall, he did a fantastic job. And it was really interesting as a listener to hear him 10 years later reflect on it, and from a psychological lens as well, because that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the communication aspect, and I'm also looking at the psychology aspect, and just to see the way in which it almost brings tears to my eyes, because you can assume that this was a traumatic experience for him. But for him to know what was happening, to know and to be able to say, hey, I'm human too, and I'm at this level with you, and I want to experience this with you, but also I have this knowledge that maybe you don't have, and so I know for sure what I did was correct. I think he's really sending a strong message about pilots in general, but specifically about him. That these people that we see as heroes are still people too. Okay, thank you so much.